Finally. Burned through enough kits, I could finally get to my Tamiya M41. Anyway, the Tamiya M41 is... What do you mean? What am I doing? I'm starting my Tamiya M41. Yeah, this one I picked up the other day. Oh, you mean my other Tamiya M41. You sure you want me to do that? All right. You asked for it. Hey everyone, this is John from EastCoastArmory.com, and I want to welcome you all today to another episode of Old Tank Repair. And for this episode, the subject matter of choice is the main character that we have here, and that is this vintage-ish Tamiya 1/35 scale M41 Walker Bulldog light tank. Just like with many of the other models in the OTR lineup, this one here was built by myself when I was much younger, and in this video I'm going to take the model from that original condition and I'm going to bring you all along throughout the course of the restoration process, bringing it up to the condition that we have here. Of course, this video here is going to be a longer format video compared to some of the other model showcase videos and project update videos that are showcased on this channel. So I recommend either watching this video in segments or possibly hitting that little gear icon in the corner if you're in a rush in order to speed through it at a faster rate. Regardless, let's go ahead and kick this video off. However, before we do, I do want to mention that this model, of course, is built for my own personal collection and it's not for sale and or purchase. However, like I often mention in these videos, I frequently take on commission build projects from models ranging between 1/35 scale to 1/6 scale. For availability and pricing information, that would be best by contacting me through the email address listed below, which is info@eastcoastarmory.com. And here's the model at the start of the rebuild. As we saw from the pre-video intro, this model started off as a Tamiya 1/35 scale M41 Walker Bulldog kit. This model here is another one of my youth builds, and I picked it up around April, May of 1997-98, so I was in either 7th or 8th grade, around there. Anyway, the model was built to this condition, and then once in this lovely condition, I went ahead and put it in my display cabinet in the rear confines of the shop, and it literally has sat there ever since. This model was in good company. It was parked next to several of the other builds that have already came across this desk and have been rebuilt and polished up into a more appropriate state, and so I guess it's long overdue that I go ahead and give this one here the same treatment. I do remember that when I was younger, I really always wanted to add one of these kits to my collection. These kits back then, and the same is still true today, were very, very prolific and were also really affordable when found. And I always wanted to get one, but at the time I never got around to it because there were so many other tank kits out there that were not as easy to track down that I had the opportunity to purchase, so I went ahead and got those, and I kept on pushing this one aside until a later date. Well, I remember one day a buddy of mine who I spilled models with in middle school, he went ahead and picked one of these kits up, and when I saw his, I instantly had to, get one myself. So I went to the same hobby shop as he did, picked up the kit, brought it home, and, well, like I said, I built it up to the condition you see it here. The model itself is predominantly built out of the box. However, I did go ahead and add a few little extra details to it, like I really still do today. However, unlike the current details that I add on my builds, the ones that are found on this model here are not going to carry over into the rebuild once it hits that point. Like I stated before, these models build extremely quickly and pretty much effortlessly. However, I can see that at some point, either during the build or slightly post-build, I had some problems with the handlebars because some of the handlebars have been replaced with bent metal wire handles that have been drilled into the side portion of the turret. Again, I'm not sure if this was a problem that I had during the build or, slightly after when I would actually play with my models, because that is something that I did at the time. Also, you can see that the model was obviously built with using Testor's red tube model glue, which is why the pieces are just starting to fall off at this point. But that's typical for models built with that type of media, which is why, again, I will take this opportunity to say, do not ever use Testor's red tube model glue when you're building models. This stuff is garbage. It doesn't apply well. It doesn't apply evenly, and it just leaves for really substandard results. So again, do not buy or use Testor's red tube model glue. Okay, unless you want to build it with the glue just so that you could rebuild it 20 years down the road. If you want to do that, knock yourself out. The glue is great for that. Other than that, the glue is complete garbage. With one of the brush guards off, you can see that the other brush guard is hanging on really for dear life. One of the support struts is broken and appears to have been broken for a really long time. Moving on to the suspension, the model does have some playability to it, which is a trademark of these older Tamiya tanks, because this one, like many of the older kits, was originally designed to be motorized, which is something I'm actually going to circle back around. As for the suspension, it's built just out of the box, nothing really much to talk about. I did make a slight modification to the sprocket that I'll touch upon in a second, though. On the track, you'll see that even 8th grader John knew that the track is made out of metal and rubber components, and I went ahead and weathered them in a similar nature that I do today, only in a much more primitive format. The tracks themselves are painted with Tester's rust paint, and then the face pads are just painted with flat black. I also went ahead and did a similar thing on the inside portion of the track, if I could find one that isn't paint scratched. You'll see that I went ahead and replicated the rubber pad section with a stripe of black paint on the other side, while the other sections are painted in metal. And again, this is a technique that I literally still do today on these exact type of tracks for really the same reasons. One thing that's really changed is just, the composition of the paint. But the technique was sound back then, and if it ain't broke, don't fix it. One thing that I do notice is that the back portion of the wheels are not really painted at all, as are the inside portions directly behind the wheels, which is why I state in my videos never to build and paint the model with the suspension still on, because this is exactly what you'll get. You will always have areas where the paint did not reach, because trying to get access to these areas with an airbrush or a spray gun are almost impossible due to all the clutter in the way. And, well, the proof is in the pudding. I still see people who do that, and it blows my mind when I see that done, because you are going to get bare, naked areas. And by the way, this is on an M41 that has a relatively easy to get to suspension. Imagine on something with an inner leaf suspension like a Tiger or a Panther. Yeah, it's just not going to work. Other things to note, on the back portion here, I went ahead and added a little length of brass chain, because why not? It's cool, or so I thought at the time. I'm just going to go ahead and say I'm not going to keep this. This is going to be pitched and jettisoned once the paint stripping starts. And hopefully I just glued this on with red tube, so it should just pop right off. Here you can see the taillights. I just went ahead and did the rookie move of painting the entire cat's eye lens just with a red paint. Obviously that's not something that's going to stick around as the build progresses. On the travel lock, the kit does have a functional travel lock, but from what I remember, it was so frail and fragile that it broke somewhere during the build, so I just glued it in place in the retracted state that you see here. That's really it for the hull. This now brings us to the turret. Like I touched upon before, several of the handles were replaced with metal wire handles that were bent in shape. On the mantlet, I could see that this model here does have the cast texturing, which back then meant you take a Dremel and you pit the ever-loving hell out of the surface in question, which, by the way, that's a terrible technique. Don't do that. And this build, just like with the other builds that featured this type of feature on the OTR lineup, is going to be receiving the same type of correction. So that is something I'm definitely going to take care of. Another thing I want to touch upon is that the lift ring found on the top portion of the mantlet here is broken. Again, must have broke off at some point during the model's history. And that piece has definitely lost its sands of time, so it will be refabricated anew when I actually dig into it. On the top portion here, we have my spring antenna bases, and these are my really old retro ones, where I really didn't know what the spring antenna bases looked like, so I just took a piece of dental wire and put it into the turret, and then I took another wire, wrapped it around a toothpick, and glued it over it, and this gave you the spring detailing. Obviously, this model will be getting either an MP65 or an MP48 spring antenna base, so these are definitely not going to be remaining once the build commences. On the back here, you can see the kit supply jerry cans. This one appears to have been broken at some point. The little handle is damaged, and looks like I tried to replicate out of a piece of metal wire. On the kit supply jerry cans, the handle is just a thin little piece. It doesn't have the three little handles that we know and see on jerry cans in general, and this is just, again, indicative of the kit of the era. This is something that I may revise. We'll see again once I actually start on it. I do remember that the kit originally had functioning bow and turret hatches, but for some reason it doesn't seem to be functional on this one anymore. Perhaps when I painted the inside of the turret with the spray paint and possibly seized everything up. We'll see once I take the turret off. Then that takes us to the 50 caliber. The M2HB is the original kit supply one, and the kit supply one is very, very simplistic in its overall detailing. Again, indicative of the era that this piece was made in. This one here, I tried to improve upon it, but apparently the little handle cracked off at some point. So this M2 is not going to be salvaged. I'm going to be pitching it for either a 3D printed one, or perhaps I might have a spare one sitting in my spare bin. We'll see how that pans out. On the M2 though, you'll see that I add a little piece of chain here to the pedestal base. This was something that was actually requested by my father the other times. Like, you know, they have chains on those for the machine guns. And I just glued the little piece of chain on the side over there for extra detailing. He was right and wrong at the same time. If anyone watches my 1/6 scale videos, you'll know that yes, there is a chain retained item held onto these pedestal bases, but that chain is used to keep a rubber ring cover cap from getting lost. If you have the gun fitted to it, the chain isn't going to be in this section over here. It's just going to be running around loose with that cover cap dangling around nearby. But again, this little bit of detailing was something that 13 or 14-year-old John didn't know. So that's something that's also going to be replaced as well. I'm looking closely at the turret right now, and I do see that I tried to sculpt or enhance some of the weld beads around the various locations on the model, but they don't appear to be nearly as rough or as crude as they were on some of the other builds that have been found on the OTR lineup. So, but again, I think I said the same thing on the Yak Panther when it was at this point, but once the paint was stripped off, it showed a bunch of other little gremlins that need to have been addressed. So again, we'll see once the paint is removed off of this model. Taking the model apart takes to a feature that I wanted to have always built into this model, but I was limited of the technology of the era. First, the turret, you can see that I went ahead and shot a little spray of white spray paint on the inside here to paint the interior, which I believe this is what fused the hatch together and prevents it from functioning. Not sure if this is something that's going to be salvageable, but it is something that I want to mention. Another thing I want to mention about the turret was kind of a snafu at the very tail end of the build. I have, and I still have it, a wooden spray box that my father made. And in the spray box, he had a light bulb assembly built into it so you could illuminate the inside and to help you when you're painting. In fact, that's where this model was actually painted. Well, at the very tail end of the build, I remember painting the model, and I would put it on top of the spray boot just so I had some better access to add some, rust and things along those lines. Well, I had the turret off like this, and it was sitting on top of the spray booth, and the area it was sitting on top of was directly over the light bulb. And the light bulb was on for a little while, so it was still warm. Unbeknownst to me, I was working on the turret. I go to pick it up, and the turret was deformed. This area over here was sitting over the hot light bulb section, and it actually caused the plastic to melt and deform in very slightly to the way we see it here. When I saw that, I was just so angry that that happened, specifically at the tail end of the build, that I do remember launching off in a tirade. But I didn't take it out on the model. That's why the model's still here. It didn't wind up in the trash. So I went ahead and tried to clean up a little bit with a Dremel. I removed a little bit of material because it wouldn't even fit on the turret. That's actually how I found out. I went to, okay, I'm done with the weathering. I went to put on the turret. It doesn't fit. What the hell? I look on the bottom. Oh, son of a... Something else that I noticed, that sometime during the model's life, the barrel did crack off, and I C8'd it in place, and looks like I did a pretty rough job with the super glue. The barrel, I believe, is a one-piece assembly, but I could still see traces of that seam line that are molded in, and the muzzle brake itself is a bit chunky in some areas. Again, this is all something I'm going to need to work on once the paint is stripped off. Back to the lower, like I stated before, one thing about this model that I always had the envision for was to make it motorized. You see, the old school Tamiya kits, as we know, were originally designed to be functional, and then at some point in the 70s and the 80s, Tamiya eliminated that function and just sold their models sans the motorization. And again, that's still basically true today. Well, one really cool thing about the Walker Bulldog was that it was so designed to be motorized that you don't even have to glue the upper and lower hulls together. Again, this is another trademark found on many of the Tamiya kits from this era. But what makes the Bulldog separate from the other ones is that on the other kits, you usually have some poly caps in the front and a little locking tab in the back. On the Bulldog, you just have this enormous little slide snap type system right here, and it just clicks the whole upper in place. You just depress it, and boom, the whole top comes right off. As you can see, just like with the turret, I went ahead and shot the inside of the hull and bow here with the flat white spray paint, seizing the hatch in the meantime, but again, it was done for the same reasons. So the piece just locks in place, and you have your static model. But I figured, you know, one day I should be able to have the technology and the skills to upgrade and motorized convert this one. And that's actually something that I want to see if I could do on this build. Another thing that I did was, if you notice on the back portion here, we have a plastic rod connecting the two sprockets together. This was a modification that I made when I was younger. The model has, like in your standard Tamiya format, you have a plug that plugs up the area where the gearbox would have went, and it has the axle integrally molded in to the appropriate shape. And that's just where the sprocket plugs into, and you're good to go. Well, on this one here, I decided to screw that, and I drilled a hole directly through both of these sections, and I slid in a piece of runner, and that gives you the axle. Unfortunately, I should have used metal because, as you can see, it's very flexible, and it proved really hard for me to play with this as a kid because with a little bit of rolling, the sprocket will just pop right off of the track because the sprocket flexes due to the tension of the track. But, you know, I didn't know that when I was younger. So because of this, I really didn't go ahead and play with this model too much, which is probably what really saved it and kept it in that little time capsule of a cabinet for me to get to it now all those years later. So to motorize convert this one, if anyone's a fan of the channel, you note that this is something that I have done on several other builds in the past. However, for this one here, I'm going to be going about it in a slightly different format. Rather than using the dual motor gearbox, I think I'm going to be able to pull it off with this unit that we have here. This is the Tamiya single motor gearbox, and it is a much simpler design compared to the dual motor setup. The gearbox is much smaller in its overall size and stature, and because of that, it may be able to fit in a tighter confines that are found on a vehicle like the Walker Bulldog. As you can see, we do have quite a cavernous rear section over here, so I believe even if this system doesn't work, I might be able to squeeze in the dual motor system, but we'll see how that pans out as the build commences. This system, by the way, I've had in the shop bouncing around for over a decade now, and it seems like every time I want to incorporate this on a model of one sort or another, it either doesn't fit, or I just have plenty of room for fitting of the dual motor system, so the single one is really not necessary. But, well, again, this one's going to be the guinea pig, and we'll see how this pans out. As for the gearbox itself, this one here, it's a bit different in terms of manufacturing compared to the dual motor setup where it uses ABS plastic. This one here is more old school where it uses stamped sheet metal. There are lots of variants on how you can configure the spindle in several orientations, as well as also different gear ratios, but I'm not really going to go into that as that is more thoroughly discussed on the box itself. If anyone is interested in this gearbox here, I have an Amazon link listed below in the video description. These units are fairly easily come by, and just again, a simple Google search should yield some good results. Also, unlike the dual motor setup, obviously this one you can't make RC because, well, you only have one motor. When it comes to RC tanking, you need a two motor setup. For the main paintwork, Tamiya acrylic olive drab was airbrushed, and for the rust and the scratched steel surfaces, this was done with using Model Master enamels. It's the same paints that were touched upon before with the tracks. Because the main base on this one is the Tamiya acrylic, the denatured alcohol is going to just cut directly through, as we saw on several of the other videos on the OTR lineup. Just like on those other videos, however, the tracks will not fare nearly as well with the paint stripping because denatured alcohol doesn't really do a good job with removing of enamel paints. But as we've seen on some of the other builds, hopefully it'll loosen it up to the point where enough of the old paint chips away, leaving for a good surface to apply the new layers of paint. However, I don't believe I'm going to have to work too hard to chip the paint off the tracks because, as you can see from just filming of this video here, how much of the paint has already chipped away. With the model back in the shop, it's time to start the rebuild. So, I have the model's hull taken apart again, just so that I can go ahead and apply the weights to the inside, just to keep the model from floating. Like I stated in a few of these other videos, plastic models have a tendency to want to float on you when you put them in a bat-type situation. The solution, however, always works best when the model is fully submerged. Some things that I'm not going to be adding to the bath at this time are the tracks, as well as also the M2. The tracks are painted with enamels, and from what I've seen on the other OTR videos, the solution doesn't really do anything with getting the paint off of the tracks. It loosens them up slightly, but it's really negligible. So the tracks, I'm just going to go ahead and deal with in another way. The M2, like I stated before, is not going to be salvaged on this build, so there's no point throwing into the solution. As you notice, the roll wheels I went ahead and removed off the model at this time, and they're all going to be housed right here in the front. Sprockets, I'll just go ahead and do them separately, thanks to this convenient little rod that we have here. For the weight, I'm just using my typical tried and true bits of random metal heavy objects that are in the shop or on the workbench. Include nails, some turnings, as well as some fittings, and looks like even a shell, or a couple shell casings wound up in the mix this time. That should be enough for the job. Alright, so let's seal this thing up. And get the denatured alcohol. Well, it's that time again. It wouldn't be an ECA OTR video otherwise. The model is all buttoned up, weighed down, and I have the bucket of denatured alcohol sitting on the table, and I'm about to go through the Safety Sally safety disclaimer. Denatured alcohol is a serious substance, so when using it, you want to take the proper safety precautions. Note I am wearing gloves because you do not want to get this stuff on your skin, and prolonged exposure to your skin can be harmful. The vapors are also harmful, so you absolutely don't want to huff it. You want to use it in a well-ventilated environment, and also you don't want to smoke anywhere near, specifically one that is completely open like you see here. But generally, don't want to smoke at all. Smoking is a terrible habit to begin with. Finally, the last thing you absolutely do not want to do at all costs is drink or ingest this stuff. Basically, bottom line, don't be a horse's ass with it. Alright, get one last good look of this model, because from here on out, it's going to be reborn. Taking the dunk in 3, 2, 1. Looks like it kind of got hung up there. Alright, so with the bucket capped off, I'm going to reposition it to a unused area of the shop, just to prevent any sort of mishaps from happening. The model's going to sit in this solution now for a good duration of time, anywhere between 24 to 48 hours. Basically, the longer you have it sitting in the solution, the better the effect the solution will have at dislodging the paint. So let's cut across to when the solution has run its course, so I could get to the actual paint stripping. Alright, well, let's go ahead and take a peek at the carnage. Alright, it's a little tricky to see the model due to the glare, and also from some of the sediment getting stirred up from when I put the bucket down, but we all know what's going to happen next. Let's go ahead and dig in with the paint strip. So I actually encountered something really interesting while trying to paint strip this one. As it turns out, I was mistaken. The paint that was on the surface was not Tamiya acrylic. Instead, it turned out to be an enamel. Probably Model Master green drab from what the color looks like to me. Regardless, because of that, the denatured alcohol, it could have been sitting in that stuff for a month or so, and not a single thing would have changed. So unfortunately, the denatured alcohol was not going to be used to get this one clean. Instead, I had to use an alternate source. And this, by the way, is a little bit different for these videos. Generally, I do the denatured alcohol bath. I scrub it off, and, I could then talk about the remainder of the build. But this one here threw me in for a curveball because of this. So I had to figure out a different way of approach to go about with the paint stripping. The problem with enamel is that generally you have to use harsher chemicals in order to get the paint off, and where this becomes a problem is with the model being made out of polystyrene. You see, with the harsher chemicals, it may and will have an effect on the polystyrene base that the model is made from. So, a lot of care had to be put into this in order to prevent that from happening. And as you can see, there's a little bit going on, but I'll touch upon that in a second. A typical source that a lot of guys use for their paint stripping would be brake fluid, and I had a bottle here on hand in the garage. I poured some in a cup and I gave it a shot. Unfortunately, I didn't see any good results with that. Now, to be fair, I did not have the piece subject to the brake fluid for a really long duration of time. I basically just took the paintbrush and smeared it on the sections that I was trying to strip, but I didn't leave it on there for that long. And I think that may have contributed to the brake fluid not having any real effect. So instead of going with that approach, I went with a technique that is a bit riskier, but was one that I know was going to yield results, but again, was one that I really had to stay on the ball with, and was partially the reason why I didn't get on film or get on video, was because I was doing a lot of back and forth with the model to make sure that the plastic stays as intact as possible. To strip the paint, I went ahead and utilized just clean strip paint thinner right over here. And although the method of getting the paint dissolved was relatively easy, it's the application where things get a little complicated. You see, paint thinner will get the enamel paint off, but it will also harm the plastic finish. In fact, if you look at the model here, you will see some of the effects of the paint thinner exposure. Note some of the areas here are chalky in their appearance, as well as being discolored. What you're seeing here is a chemical reaction with the polystyrene being left to the paint thinner for a long duration of time. The model is actually damaged at this point. Just fortunately, the amount of damage is purely superficial and it's not anything to worry about. But if exposed to the material for longer durations of time, that will change and the plastic will become very brittle. Another part that took a good walloping was the main commander hatch. The hatch itself, I lost one of the pivoting hinge sections. I'm not sure if I already had that missing from the paint stripping job or if I lost it years ago. Hard to tell, but I have one of the pieces here and I'll be addressing that again as the video progresses. But if you'll notice, one of the arms is still painted, the other one isn't. That's because this piece cracked off on me during the paint stripping process. There's no point to get the paint stripped off of that section there, so I just simply re-glued it on at the earliest convenience. This is the type of thing where if you don't fix it right away, you're just going to end up losing it. So that's been repaired. The spare track rack also had a small little piece crack on it. That too was repaired. And again, I'm in the process of going to be remounting the headlights momentarily. The paint was stripped off the smaller bits in a good degree, and it should be enough for me to progress further. But this one is going to need to receive quite a bit of new replacement bits, either scratch built or copies from a donor model. For the gun barrel, this here really took a bit of a beating. You'll see that the piece is actually, literally just falling apart on me, and this has to do with the frailness of the plastic now. This was only exposed to the paint thinner for not a really long period of time, and the seams are already splitting. The plastic literally just snapped off on me. I'm not even sure if I'm going to keep this barrel because of this. As you can see, the brittle plastic is really starting to show its ugly head. The barrel itself, again, obviously for falling apart, but it too is just a really rough component. I could possibly clean it up. One thing I did notice was that when I did install this to the model, I installed it upside down, so it's going to take a bit of work to try to salvage this. But honestly, I think I'm just going to swap this out for an aftermarket one. Fortunately, there have been a few aftermarket components out there for M41 Walker Bulldogs, and I think swapping out the 76 might be a good idea for this one. For the wheels, currently I did not paint strip them. They're still sitting in the denatured alcohol. Honestly, I don't think I am. I think I'm just going to keep them as is, and just paint over them. The paint that are on the surface is either non-existent, and where it is found, it's on in a pretty thin manner, which should make the application of the new paint on it really not that big of a deal. So I think that's how I'm going to roll with that. The brush guards are completely toast. I think I'm just going to fabricate new ones out of metal for this one. And yeah, we'll see how that pans out. But from this point onward, I believe I could actually continue with the build. Oh, one more thing I want to touch upon before I head on out. Again, the brittle plastic is really starting to take effect. Here you can see the lower portion of the turret. It's just falling apart on me as I speak. Keep in mind, this was glued with red tube, but in combination with the harsh paint thinner, it's really having, it's starting to show its ugly head. Fortunately, this is something I can fix, and I can fix it immediately, which is something I'm going to be doing sooner than later. But so now that you've seen the condition of the model at this point, it's now time to get it to the repaired state. The first thing I'm going to do is to convert the model to motorization. Like I stated before, I'm going to be utilizing this Tamiya stamped metal gearbox. And the gearbox had to go through some slight modifications in order for it to fit in the tight confines of the rear portion of the M41. This gearbox has been bumping around the shop for quite a while and has had some modifications done to it for possible use on other projects, but it never really panned out. That's why we could see this portion here that has been cut away. For the M41 though, I did have to make a tweak to this little piece of steel right up here. With the way the original piece is designed, this steel sticks up further and it basically is on par or slightly above the gears that we have right here. Well, because of the design of the M41, note the two angles that we have here that are bending down. This is going to interfere with this piece sitting in place, so this metal here had to have been removed. This was a fairly quickly done procedure with a Dremel with a cutting stone, and then with a needle file I just went ahead and polished it down so that there are no more burrs or sharp edges on it. For the piece to sit inside of the rear hull, if you look at the Tamiya kit, you'll see that there are a few inset wells found in this section. There are these two built-up areas which are for the Tamiya gearbox of the era. However, that one was in different specs as this one here, so the two pieces are not compatible. Also, if I try to just drop this piece in, you'll see that it doesn't really fit in all that well. And this will specifically make it difficult to secure it in place. Well, that's why I went ahead and made this little piece of plastic here for this purpose. The plastic just drops directly in and sits flush on the hull, giving a nice flat surface for the gearbox to sit right on top of. If I move the gearbox up, you'll see that it is at the perfect height where the axle is dead center on the final drive mount, which is where the sprocket needs to be. When you're doing this, you have to take a lot of care to make sure that everything is nice and square, because if you secure this in canted, you're going to have results that are less than desirable. And obviously this is a really over-dramatized appearance, but even if it's slightly off-center, this can lead to issues because this will interfere with the track tension. So a lot of care has to be exhibited at this point to make sure everything is squared away. The motor itself is going to be secured to the plastic card here with these two fasteners. They are wood screws, which is great for it to grip into the plastic surface. Once everything is secured, I'm going to reinforce it with adhesives, and then hopefully then everything just drops directly into place and I could hook up the rest of the electronics and get the thing running. Once the gearbox is secured to that plate, it's then time to drop it into the model. To do this, though, you first need to have the alignment set for the sprockets. For this model here, and generally for most of the 135s, I tend to have the sprockets in the same location as they were found originally on the static release. So where those original holes line up, that's basically a good general key point to align the new axle that's hooked up to the motorization unit. Once that's squared away, the unit is then mounted securely to the vehicle, and in this case, I just super glued it to the lower hull. Circling back to what I stated before, you really have to take care in making sure that the alignment is as straight and as square as possible. Because obviously, if there's something that's wrong, this is going to cause nothing but problems, because you're going to have one side that's going to have a tension that differs from the other, and when the model is a functioning one, it can throw off the visual look of the model where you have a little extra slack, and the second thing is it's going to possibly throw track or it'll drive around in a circle, neither of which is really ideal. As for hooking up the sprockets to the axle, this is something that it was actually on my to-do list for the longest period of time, and honestly, I'm surprised it took me this long to actually make it. But as we've stated before, or if anyone has ever built any old school motorized tanks from Tamiya, you'll know that when the tanks were originally designed to be motorized, you have this little indentation molded into the sprocket that looks like a giant hex bolt. Well, this was an engagement point to secure onto the gearbox. With the hex bolt engaged, the sprocket will not slip, and the power from the axle will be forced to turn the sprocket, and the tank will be able to move. Well, to motorize convert it, I needed to replicate this feature. On previous builds, I would just go ahead and fasten, or not fasten, but fabricate a brand new one out of a turned piece of cast resin. Take some cast resin in a cylindrical format, turn it on the lathe to the appropriate width, drill a hole in the middle of it via the lathe, and then just glue it to the sprocket, and then that would fit to the shaft found on the Tamiya gearboxes. Well, rather than doing that, I decided to finally recreate the actual hex component that engages the sprocket. This component here is a new 3D printed piece from East Coast Armory, and here you can see how the piece is going to be offered. The piece is offered in a set where you have a number of these components, so that with one set here you can motorize convert a large number of these 1/35 scale models. This set here will work on either the single motor gearbox like this one here, or the dual motor gearbox, which is generally seen on many of my other motorized converted builds. And it's also important to note that many individuals out there who RC convert these small scale models utilize that Tamiya dual motor gearbox for really some good reasons. What's neat about the 3D printed piece is that not only does it engage on the sprocket hex housing, but you'll see that the inside shaft is also a small diameter hex. This is because the hex, or I should say the shaft found on the Tamiya gearboxes, is a smaller little hex type platform. So with this, you have double hex engagement, and the piece will not slip on you during the model's operation. Once the axle is at the appropriate size, the piece slips into its appropriate location, no adhesives are necessary, and then the sprocket just plugs in place as it would originally on the old school Tamiya gearbox. This set here is not offered on the EastCoastArmory.com catalog, but is instead sold exclusively through the ECA Shapeways store. Listed below, there's a link that takes you directly to the store where I have this component, as well as other non-1/6 scale and 1/16 scale detail components. This is done because these parts don't really fit in my standard catalog, so the Shapeways store is a place where you will find these smaller scale detail fittings. With the gearbox attached to the hull, I went ahead and temporarily plopped on the made road wheels because I think it's time to take this one for a test drive. And by the way, this is something that, to me, it feels like a wrong that's being corrected because, like I stated earlier, I always envisioned this model here being functional. So I'm going to go ahead and pop the tracks back on. And these slip on as they would on really any Tamiya model. You could see the track tension is where it needs to be, which is a good sign. Okay, now to run it, I'm just going to temporarily hook up the leads to their appropriate locations, and we should see the thing move across the desk here. So, let's see if this pans out. Oh. And it's alive! Alright, so you can see that the model had a successful initial test run. Albeit it's a very slow one, but that was to be expected because this is running on a single motor, of course, instead of the dual motor, which obviously would have given it more pickup. But then again, it is a tank, and they do have a first gear after all. So, so far, this is actually really, really promising. The next step, though, is to figure out how to get this battery pack and a switch into the model. Normally, this is actually something that doesn't take too much thought, but as you can see, with the tight confines here of the M41's hull, this is going to be a little bit trickier. But I think I have a solution in mind. Also, another thing to figure out is exactly where to put the switch. Now, originally, this model would have been powered by 2C batteries, so which is kind of funny that I'm having a little difficulty inserting a pack of AA's, but the switch would have been, I believe, in this area right over here, possibly this area. It's hard to tell offhand, but regardless, I'm going to need to figure out a way to put the switch in. Also, just like with many of my other motorized models, I'm going to have a three-way switch so that the model can go both forward and in reverse. But we'll see how that pans out as the video goes on. And I guess I might as well take the opportunity to see if the upper hull fits on the lower, because that would be bad if that wasn't the case. And as you can see, it just drops directly into place without the gearbox striking in any way the upper hull of the vehicle. So far, so good. So after filming the last scene, I was looking over the footage, and also I was looking at the model itself, and I realized that the model had this weird knock to it, where it had an audible knocking noise coming out of the back, and the model would actually jitter, and it was something that was happening routinely. Every single time, almost like clockwork, there was a knock, a jitter, and then the model would progress as normal. So I went ahead and looked into it further, and I found out that that knock was actually coming from the way the gearbox was fitted into the vehicle. You see, with the way this gearbox is, you have this brass worm gear, and then that makes contact with this brass spur gear, and then that's what turns the axle. Well, on the model over here, because of the way it's mounted, and with the way the gear overhangs out of the gearbox slightly, I had to remove a little bit of plastic material from the rear wall here just to get the thing to fit. And it did fit in perfectly fine. It was just a little bit of material that needed to be removed with a Dremel. But one thing that I didn't factor in was that there's a small little grub screw that secures the axle to the gear. And that little grub screw protrudes from the gear ever so slightly. It's only like a fraction of a millimeter. But it was enough where it was making contact with the rear wall, and that was that knock and jitter that you were seeing when the model's in operation. So the gear was spinning freely, then when that grub screw would pop up again, it would smack the back of the wall, the gearbox would jitter a little bit, and then the model would progress until we hit that point again. So what I did was, once I realized that, with a Dremel and with a very small router bit, I actually went in here and I removed a little bit of material where the grub screw was making contact. This was a very tricky procedure to do because the gearbox is fitted to the model permanently at this point, and it's not like the old school one where I just loosen a screw and I could take it out. So I had to figure out a way to get in there in order to remove the material. And fortunately, with the location that this piece is found at, I was able to just flex the model's lower hull slightly in order to get the drill or the router bit in there on the Dremel to take care of the issue. I did gouge a little bit of the plastic up here, but it's not a problem. It's underneath the rear plate, so it's not going to be visible. But that is something that I did want to touch upon. Also, now if we test it, well, let's see how much better the model does run. As you can hear, there's no knock or any sort of jitter whatsoever, and the model runs perfectly smooth. And in a typical fashion, when one thing is fixed, another problem tends to rear its head. If you look carefully at the end of that last take, you'll see that the idler slowly was working itself off of the model. Well, I took the idler off, and there was absolutely no polycap retention whatsoever on it. So, with a pair of needle nose pliers, I basically just wedged the piece open, and with red tube glue being what it is, the piece popped right open without any problems. And you can see that the polycap here, let's see if I can get it in better light, appears to be cracked. Yep, the polycap is completely toast. So fortunately, I do have several polycaps on hand, spares from other builds, so this shouldn't be a problem that I can't fix. So I'm going to go ahead, drop a new one in place, reassemble the idler, and the model should be hopefully ready to proceed from there. Alright, so take two. The polycap has been swapped out, the wheel has been repaired, and, well, let's see if that has any sort of bearing whatsoever on the situation. So the solution that I'm going to do on this one is I'm going to remove this area here of the bulkhead just so that I have the clearance for the battery pack to slide in. This will have two functions. First, it allows me to fit the battery inside the model, and with the top on it no less, but it'll also double act as a support for the battery, preventing it from flopping around on the inside when the model is in operation. Needless to say, the bulkhead cannot be removed on this one because this is, like I stated before, the only way that the upper can be mounted to the model in a removable format, and for a motorized model, that's kind of important. For the removal itself, I'm going to be using the router bit that I have here. This small router bit can be found via this link below, and that's my vendor, and also I have a link in the video description. As for the bulkhead itself, this tab here, I need to have some sufficient material left in this section just to keep the piece from snapping off. Depending how I feel once the material is removed, I may have to reinforce it with extra pieces of plastic, but we'll see how that pans out once the material has been deleted. Okay, so obviously the battery situation has been resolved. The next thing I need to figure out is how to patch in the wires to the motor as well as to the switch. Like I stated before, I'm going to have a three-way switch on the model, so the model could go forward and reverse. But I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to mount the switch in the hull. So I think I'm actually going to take a page from the M551 Sheridan build that I did a little while ago. If we can recall, on that model, I went ahead and converted to motorization, and the way I fitted the switch in that build was the switch was located in the turret underneath the commander's cupola. For this build here, I think I'm going to utilize the exact same type of technique. For the hole, even though the turret location is pretty much blanked out, if need be I could drill another hole into this section over here and not cause any problems. But with this large slot here, I think it's suffice where I could just run the wires directly up and into the turret. Because on the Tamiya M41 the loaders, or I should say the commander's cupola hatch, is fully functional, not so much at this point here, but on the standard kit, the piece is a fully functional component. This makes it a really convenient location to mount on the switch. So let's see if I'm going to be able to actually pull that off. Before I progress with the remainder of the wiring, I need to address some of the fixes that need to be made to the lower hull. On the front and rear areas over here, this is where the kit supplied tow hooks would have originally been found. The tow hooks were in rough shape before the paint stripping process, and after the paint stripping process, they did not survive at all, so they're not going to be salvaged. Like I showed before, the pieces are going to be replaced with cast resin components that are copies from the original Tamiya tooling. However, when the pieces were removed off these locations, they weren't a clean break, and the holes in the model were actually quite substantial, larger than the actual kit component would be when dropped in place. So in order to prep the area for the new component to be remounted, I'm going to go ahead and plug the areas up completely, allow me to do a little bit of body work, and then once the surface is prepped, I could then go through the mounting procedure with the new replacement pieces. In order to do this, I took some Plastruct strip, which was the exact same width of the holes, cut them to shape, and glued them in place. Once the glue sets, the area is already looking much better, but in order to make sure it's a nice seamless look, I'm going to take some red putty, put a smear on these locations. After the part is polished down with some sandpaper, I can then go ahead and commence with the remounting. And here's the model with the wiring now fully completed. At the moment, this is just basically a glorified bench test, but once the turret bodywork is completed, I can then proceed with cleaning everything up. What you see here is a very simple circuit where we have a battery, a motor, and a switch that's wired to run the motor either in forward, reverse, or in the off position. This is done with a 3-position switch right over here. This is just a simple cheap little switch that I picked up off of eBay a number of years ago in a bag full of them, which is why you tend to see them a lot in these videos. The switch itself works pretty good for what they are, and for wiring it, it looks a bit complex in this format over here. However, here you can see a diagram. It's actually the diagram that I use to wire this thing up. And if anyone is wondering, I do have a link to this diagram listed in the video description below. Back to this model over here, what makes this model different from some of the other motorized conversions that I've done is with the size of the wires and plugs that I'm using for this build. On some of the other previous builds, like the Sheridan, as well as the M3 Lee CDL with the working light, that model I also went ahead and utilized a disconnect type system. However, for that model, I used a 2-pin quick disconnect plug that was a little bit larger than the ones you see here. Those plugs are awesome. I love using them on a multitude of builds because of how simple they are and how good they work. However, for a 1/35th scale model here, they tend to be on the larger end. They still work perfectly fine, but when space is definitely a luxury, the bigger size plugs are less than ideal. They still work though, I'm not going to change them on those other builds. But for this one here, rather than going with those plugs, I was on Amazon looking for 2-pin quick connects, and I ran to these ones here, and these fit the bill perfectly. You can see that they are much smaller in size compared to the other ones that I mentioned before, and are easier to stuff inside of a small vehicle like this one. The link to these are found in the video description below in case anybody is interested in acquiring a set of these. The pieces come in a pack where you get tons of them, so obviously I'm going to be doing a lot of small scale motorized conversions as time goes on. As for the function, well, pretty simple. In the middle is off. If I hit the switch in one direction, the model will go forward, and if I go in the opposite direction, the model will go in reverse. Very simple. Something that I've incorporated on several other builds in the past, and this one here is no different. So looking over all of the parts that I have, I was able to see what was salvageable and what wasn't. One of the biggest pieces on this build that was not going to be salvaged is going to be the mantlet, and as well as the rotor. In some situations, I would try to see if I could polish this up and, repair it. However, rather than doing that, since I have another M41 that I'm working on as a fresh kit, it's easier for me just to make a copy of that model's components and just use them on this build, and this one here can languish away in the spare parts bin. Along with the mantlet, this is true for several other components that are found on this model. So, here you can see the solution to these problems. In these two cups over here, I have components from a fresh M41 Walker Bulldog from Tamiya that I'm actually doing a separate model showcase video and review on. And while that build is going through its paces, this is the perfect opportunity to take the components that are fresh from that kit, make molds of them in order to restore this old one. To do this, I'm going to make molds of these components, and I'm going to cast replacements in cast resin. If anyone's a fan of the ECA channel, you'll know that I've been doing resin casting and mold making now for a very, very, very long time. So this here is something that's basically, my bread and butter. I have had a few questions over the years on how exactly do I go through my castings and my mold making, and although some of those are trade secrets, I can't say everything, I will go through some of the overall basics. Here we see the components here that are snipped directly off of the runners and are glued into these two plastic cups. The plastic cups are going to act as the vessel to hold the molding material in while it sets. Once the molding material is fully set, the plastic cup is torn, discarded, and then I have the mold with the pieces in it. The pieces are carefully extracted out of the mold, and now I have the cavities in place in order to pour in the liquid resin. In this cup over here, you could see the components for the mantlet, the rotor, as well as also the pintle mount. Although I'm going to be making some changes to it on this build, but making a copy of the kit one gives me a good starting point, and I could progress from there. The other cup here consists of several other just loose fittings, And as you can see, compared to some of the other OTR videos I've done in the past where I have needed to make resin duplicates or replacements for some of the missing kit supplied or damaged kit supplied parts, for this one here, it's going to be a lot more substantial because of just the poor condition this model was in compared to some of the other ones that have already came across the OTR video series. So back to this soon-to-be mold, you can see here we have the rear hooks that are found on the back, the turret hatch hinges, the toe shackles, some turret handles, other turret lift rings, and I also am going to be making a copy of the MP65 antenna bases. Not so much for use on this build per se, but it's actually a good piece to have for just, other builds that come across my desk. And the MP65s that are rendered by Tamiya on this old tooling here, they're actually really, really good and can easily enhance another model if/when the need be does arise. Another thing I want to point out about mold making is a very important one. It's actually one that takes a little bit more thought than some people might imagine, and that is exactly how to position the components in the mold so that when you pour the rubber, as well as most importantly when you pour the resin, how the liquid is going to flow in and get into all the recesses. Some components have things that we call undercuts. Undercuts are areas where it may cause a stoppage either with an air bubble or with the tolerances of some of the parts where the liquid is not going to flow into its appropriate location and the castings are not going to come out in an appropriate manner. So you need to plan that out in advance, and basically you have to think of everything being inverted, because when you're casting, the mold's actually going to look like this. So the liquid needs to flow in, and you really want to have gravity work for you. And there are some tips and tricks for that, but that's getting kind of in the weeds for something that's just a gloss over that I'm touching upon here. Another thing that is extremely important for making molds is determining what rubber to use. There are lots of different rubber manufacturers out there, and not all of them are created evenly. Some of them are really crappy and some of them are really good, but even though one might be really great for this one type of application, if you're using it for something else, it might not necessarily be the best way to go. And what I mean by that is how tough or how flexible the rubber is. Some rubbers out there are stiffer and others are more flexible, and this is actually extremely important. If the rubber is really, really flexible, that's fantastic for casting certain applications, like the mantlet here, for instance. You want to have a nice soft rubber so that you could really get in there, pry the piece open so that the liquid can flow in, and it also helps with extraction, because if you have a frail component, the softer rubber is a great way to move things out of the way in order to extract the component. However, if you have components that are thin in nature, you want to use a stiffer type of rubber, because one drawback of the softer stuff is that when you put the material in, the rubber will have a tendency to bulge or deform more likely compared to something that is of a stiffer type. But the stiffer stuff is more rigid and will prevent that type of deformation from happening. Again, it's kind of a seesaw in exactly what rubber works best for what application, and as for when and how to use it, that unfortunately comes with experience, and after you've done it, or I should say after you've made a mistake a number of times, you'll finally be able to know which one's which. For my molding and casting uses, I actually utilize materials from the company Smooth On. I've been using them for over 15 years now, and their products are highly recommended, and they do have a YouTube channel, so I recommend checking them out, and you can learn a lot of stuff and what materials to use for your own projects. For both of these applications here, I'm going to be using the softer stuff because, again, of the finely molded details in question, and also with the type of volumes I'm going to be casting with. And what I mean by volumes, I'm talking about not necessarily the number of castings, but with the amount of fluid physically going into these objects over here, the softer material is more beneficial for this type of application compared to the harder stuff. But again, if anyone out there has a question or wants to know more about that, I recommend checking out Smooth On's YouTube channel or giving them a call. Those guys are very, very responsive, and they are very knowledgeable in this subject. I mean, they kind of have to be. They produce this stuff after all. So, as you can see, I'm about to actually head into mold very shortly. And before I do, there's one other thing I want to mention, and that is with release agents. This is actually a topic of contention out there. It seems there's two schools of ideas on this. You have the school of use release agents for molding and casting, and the school of you don't use any release agents for either of those two. And in my opinion, and from my experience, the release agents are definitely something that you should do for both casting and mold making. Castings, you can get away with using a release agent maybe once every 3 castings or so, but I will say this, the molds last a hell of a lot longer if you use the release agent on every cast. For mold making, there's no excuse. The release agents are the best, and they really do aid with the extraction of the masters, and specifically if you're dealing with finely molded detail parts, it can prevent parts from breaking off. As for the release agents, there are a lot of brands out there, and no two are created evenly. For my personal needs, for masters, I use this material over here in this gnarly looking can. And this stuff, why I like to use is because it is a wax-based substance and it is plastic safe. And I cannot stress that enough. When I first started casting resin about almost, actually over 20 years ago now, the first release agent that I used to use was actually a toluene-based stuff, and it was harmful. It just destroyed polystyrene components. And I do not recommend that stuff. I'm going to leave the company's name out of this. I don't even think they're even around anymore, honestly. Or if they are, they've been bought out so many times. Like I don't know who's who anymore. But this is the stuff I get from Smooth On. It's awesome. It's plastic safe, and you can just a few toots on the inside here, and you're basically ready to go. When it comes to release agents, you don't want to over drench it. Just a quick little and you're all set. For cast resin, you can use this stuff too, but there's another material that I use called Universal Mold Release, and that is what I use primarily for resin casting. This stuff can be used too, and I used it several times, usually when there's an emergency and I'm out and I need to get some castings done. It'll work just fine, but you have to have a release agent, in my opinion. The last thing I do want to touch upon, and it's actually one of the most important bits of equipment that you have to have, in my opinion, for casting and mold making, is a pressure chamber. You have to have one. No ands, ifs, or buts about it. That is what separates professional quality resin components compared to junk parts. The thing is, when it comes to mold making and resin casting, but specifically more true for the mold making, is that the material is a and B 2-part liquid. You pour it together and then you stir to activate it, and then you pour it into the vessels. Well, it's just like when you bake a cake. If you ever use an egg beater or a whisk, you're stirring the substance, and then when you set the bowl aside, you're going to see air bubbles popping up through. Well, that's because the whisk infused air into the mixture, and the same exact thing happens with this stuff here. The only problem, though, is that when you let the material set and it solidifies, the air bubbles get trapped in whatever position that they are stuck in on their way up to the surface. And these air bubbles actually cause impurities in the mold. And because of that, the molds will not have the crisp level of detail that is actually found on the masters that they're being molded in. The resin castings are no different. When the bubbles solidify into the resin, a lot of times they'll accumulate on the surface or possibly even in a choke point or two on the component, and it's going to lead for a poor quality cast. In fact, there's actually a term out there for unpressurized molds and castings, and they're called slosh molds or slosh castings. That's one term. Another term out there, it's called and that's because that's the quality you're going to get if you don't have a pressure chamber. You're going to get very poor quality molds and equally poor quality castings. And you could tell a casting that's been made in the slosh method from a mile away. In fact, it's because of slosh molds why the garage cast resin industry has such a negative attitude towards it among scale modelers out there for as long as it has, is because of that reason. When you look at parts that are made in 3D print or in polystyrene, everything looks perfect and clean, and then you look at something done in a slosh mold, and it's got pinholes, it's got air bubbles, sometimes half the thing isn't casted. It's a disaster. And again, it's because the pieces are not pressurized, or even the molds are not pressurized. In my opinion, you need to do both. If you do both, you will have components casted that will match perfectly and look indistinguishable from the polystyrene counterparts, which if anyone has watched my videos out there, you'll probably know what I'm talking about. And I'm pretty sure someone out there is a big advocate for slosh molds, and John, I do slosh molds, and it's like, okay, well, bro, I've been doing this now since 2002, and trust me, I've made enough mistakes in my time to know good quality molds from crap ones. And we've all seen it. If you've ever been to a comic book store and you've seen some wargaming stuff from a small outfit, or if you've been to any aftermarket company for planes or tanks, you can tell poor quality castings, which we also call popcorn castings, which, you know, they look awful. And you compare that to some of the higher quality resin cast piece out there, you know, there's really no comparison. And aside from pressure casting, there's another school out there called vacuum castings. The difference is that with pressure castings, you put these in a airtight vessel and you pump air into the container, and that pressurized air will cause the bubbles to evaporate and come to the surface, which will leave you for a pure rubber mold or a pure resin casting. The other school is very similar, where you have an airtight vessel, but you're actually hooking up to a vacuum and you're sucking the air out of the chamber, doing basically the exact same thing. As for which one's better than the other, honestly, in my opinion, they are quite literally on an even keel, both of which will give you the exact same end result, which will be excellent quality molds and castings. Unfortunately, both of which do require some specialty equipment, or equipment that was made for something that you actually have to MacGyver your way into making it for something else. But once you accomplish both of those, you'll be able to achieve your end result. Whew. Okay, so with that out of the way, I'm going to go ahead and get these molded, and I'm going to put them in my pressure chamber. As for the pressure chambers themselves, and most importantly, the pressures that I use for my molds and castings, sorry guys, but that's a trade secret. I'm not going to show you how to do that. But let's just cut across to when the things are filled up, and we'll see what the final outcome of the molds look like at that point. And after the allocated period of time, the rubber has been set. Notice that the rubber is completely smooth and there are absolutely no air bubbles found into the material. This again is because of the pressure chamber. So from here, it's now time to cut them open. So I'm going to go ahead and put a little incision in the plastic cup and carefully open the piece up like a flower. When it gets to the bottom portion, you want to be careful because the pieces are glued to the plastic cup, and if you pull too much, you'll actually rip them out in a manner that is actually harmful to either the part or to the mold. So you want to be careful. Okay, with the solo cups now destroyed, these are going to be thrown to the recycling, and then I could go ahead and get to the actual removal of the masters from the mold. And this now takes to the next most important thing with mold making, and that's with the actual extraction of the masters. To help pull some of these parts out, because they may have undercuts on them, you can't just yank them out. You'll just ruin the mold that way. So you have to use a X-Acto, or in this case a mini box cutter over here, to carefully add incisions to strategic areas of the rubber. And this will allow the piece to open up, but open up in an even manner, so that you don't have a cut line that runs this way along a part, right? And then it just goes off and veers off this way, and this will cause some problems. The piece will still have rubber completely encasing the component, and it's going to lead for a poor casting. So this is why, by the way, a lot of these rubbers are translucent or clear, is so that it allows you to visually see where the parts are, and you can make the incisions accordingly. So some of these parts, though, don't need that. So let's see. I'm going to carefully pry this open. By the way, this is that flexible rubber that I was talking about. Okay, so these lift rings here for the turret, obviously they are rings, so there's a little bit of rubber that's in between each of those segments. So with the blade, I'm going to go ahead and add a little incision right here next to these portions, which are going to open up the eyelets and will then allow me to remove the part. I could also add a little incision right here, which will also help when it comes time to casting the resin, because the liquid will flow in easier and you'll have less of a problem trying to get the air out. You're basically doing surgery when you're doing this. Okay, as you can see, this one here still has a little bit of rubber in that little hollowed out area, so nice little cut, and bink, the piece pops right out. So there you can see the now freshly made mold, and that will output a good quality component. So let's do this some more. Okay, same thing with these ones over here. Okay, because of the hook, I'm going to add a little cut right over here. And you'll notice I'm also going all the way to the end on this one, because this will again allow the piece to open up easier, which will make casting and extraction go by with less effort. There we go. Doesn't look like much right now, but trust me, after the resin gets casted, it's going to look pretty good. On some items, like these MP65s, they just yank directly out. But I'm still going to add an incision this way just to help get the resin into this really thin little area up here. Trying to get resin to flow in there is going to be a bit troublesome. So just a nice little incision right down the center. And there we go. Alright, so I'm going to finish clearing this piece out, and then I'm going to go to the mantlet. Now the mantlet's an interesting one because of its shape. We have the runner that was snipped off of the tree, glued to the bottom of the cup, and then because of that you have a long descent downward, and then the mantlet curves. And you can probably see that, hopefully with the lighting here, you can see the mantlet through the translucent rubber. So first thing I'm going to do is actually clear off the plastic that's up here from the cup. And there you can see the original runner. Alright, so I'm going to make a lateral or a vertical incision like this. You never want to go this way on a component. You always want to go with the edge of it. It makes for a cleaner mold and cleaner casting. You have to carefully carve it out. The more care you exhibit on the part at this point here, the less cleanup work you're going to have to do with the actual resin casting. Obviously, this gap in between the runners cannot stay, so you have to put a segment cut in there. Segment cut on the barrel trunnion mount hole. And then, of course, last but not least, we have those two eyelets or lift rings right here. We're just going to put a nice little incision over there. And then another one on the other side. Now, sometimes, depending on the shape of the part, you only need to make an incision on one side, sometimes two sides. Again, this just depends on how easy it is to extract the part. This also involves depth. On one side, you may have a incision that runs deeper. On the other side, maybe half or a quarter way. For this one here, I am going to I don't think I need to go that far because of the soft rubber that this is. Yeah, I think I could just cut. If this was a stiffer rubber, I would have had to have another incision on the opposite side, but as you can see, the piece was extracted, and we have ourselves a good mold. Alright, for this one here, the trunnion, this should just lift right out. Just like so. I am going to add a little incision right here on these two little nubs, just to prevent air from getting trapped there, because something like that, like these two little sections right here, when the resin flows in, it's going to either miss these or it will just fill a part way because of the air bubble that will undoubtedly be in those areas. So by adding a little incision on each of those sections, it acts as an air vent so that the air can go right out and the resin can flow in. Okay, so all the parts were successfully extracted, and here we have the molds. These guys are going to go directly into a Ziploc bag so that I don't lose them, which would be really anticlimactic because these parts are really, really nice. So these are going to be bagged, put with the other M41, and when I jump to the point on that build where I need these pieces, I can simply just remove off the sprues and install them on the model. And after the parts are casted, this is what they'll look like. The other mold I went ahead and fred off camera, and here you can see what the components look like fresh out of the mold. They still have some flash around them from the incision cuts, however, the components are absolutely perfect and will clean up into very representable pieces. Here you can see what the little front lift ring looks like, and as one can clearly notice, it is indistinguishable from the Tamiya counterpart. Some of these smaller little bits popped off during the extraction process, but it's okay because I have them all on the counter that's currently off camera, and they're going to be put in a little bag just so I don't lose them. With the other parts placed aside, I'm going to go ahead now and free up this mold. The securing rubber band has been removed. The rubber bands are used during the casting process. It keeps the molds together and it prevents any sort of leakage from the resin dripping out from the cut lines that I touched upon before. So after a little bit of elbow grease, I was able to clean up the bottom portion here of the bustle as well as the bustle bin. Right now, I'm taking my needle file over here and I'm just engraving over the lines on the turret, which I went ahead and used a Dremel originally to sculpt on some weld beads. The weld beads are a little too crude looking, so a few passes with a needle file will clean them up. The similar technique has also been seen on several other of the OTR builds that are found on this channel. And after a few passes with the needle file, you can see how much more improved the surface looks compared to the way we had it before. During the procedure, I did skip over the path a few times, putting a gouge onto the surface, which is something that can easily happen when you're going with that procedure. Fortunately, all these gouges are not something that is irreversible, and with a little bit of body work, the pieces are going to be polished away. But more on that to come. The next thing I'm going to focus on is this front plate area over here. As we saw, I went ahead and in my youth, I added the cast texturing to these sections, which means taking a Dremel and just gouging the hell out of the piece. So this is something that obviously needs to be corrected at this point in the build, because once the mantlet and the rotor go on, you're not going to be able to get access to this section anymore. At the moment, I have a surface of thick super glue applied to the area, which is going to plug up those holes. If anyone has seen that other OTR video with the Tamiya Yak Panther, the procedure is literally identical. So with the super glue set, I'm going to do some wet sanding with 150 and 400 grit sandpaper, and that should be enough to smooth and polish down this surface. The biggest area to watch out for was with the fasteners that are integrally molded into this plate. Those have to be kept, and when I was applying the glue, I carefully added it around the locations so that the fasteners are untouched. We're going to see how well that turned out after the clunk here is fully polished away. Well, after a few minutes with the wet sanding, the surface is completely smooth, and I think all the divots have been taken care of. It's kind of hard to get on camera, but if you hold the panel up in a certain angle in the light, you can see a reflection bouncing off the surface. At this point here, if there were any impurities or imperfections, you would see the divots show up, but it doesn't appear to be the case. So I think this here has been fully taken care of. Also, the fasteners, for the most part, have survived the polishing procedure, which is great. And from here, it's time to actually start rebuilding the turret. Just like with many of the other components on this rebuild, the turret went through absolute hell during the paint stripping process. I mean, you can see that the upper and lower sections are basically hanging together with a thread. Although it kind of reminds me of a venomous snake. Well, the dangerous venomous serpent visuals aside, it's actually a good thing that this happened because it allowed me to remove the original beat-to-death trunnion and mantlet system, and I could now drop in place a freshly casted resin one. Once the unit is placed in, I could then glue the upper and lower turret halves back together again with a more appropriate adhesive compared to the old school red tube, and then from there I could just polish down the remainder of the seams and progress with the actual rebuild of many of the turret's fittings. So here's the turret after the wet sanding was done to both the sides, as well as addressing several of the gouges that were made to the roof. And the turret is definitely polishing up very, very nicely. So once the wet sanding was concluded, I went ahead and added some red putty to the following areas. These are to fill in the oversized holes that were present on the side of the turret from when I screwed up as a kid and drilled the holes into the side so I could fix metal wire for the use of the grab handles. So these right now are in their dry time, and as soon as the putty sets, I'll be able to polish everything down nice and smooth. While on the topic of the red putty, the next most crucial thing that I always wanted to fix on this model, literally since I built it, was again the lower portion here. Like I stated before, this got warped during the tail end of assembly, and as for a example on how deformed this section is, here I have a fresh turret molding from another Tamiya M41, and note this area over here, and you can see exactly how deformed it wound up because of that stupid hot light. So this is definitely something I'm going to be dealing with. The warpage is both in this area where it sunk into the piece, but also it caused a bowing feature right over here. If I grab the upper hull and I secure the turret to the upper, you will see, if possible, that the piece has a little bow upward where it makes contact with the turret. It's not too much, which is actually a good thing, but it's something I do want to address. Off camera, I went ahead and removed a little bit more material in this section over here because the turret was binding up pretty substantially on the little rotation area, and of course that's due to the deformation of before. So that was just addressed with a Dremel with a high-speed removal bit. The funny thing is, when I first built the model, it was way more deformed to the point where I couldn't put the turret on anymore, and that's how I found out that the turret was messed up. So when I was younger with a Dremel with a sanding drum, I basically removed the amount of material to the point where the turret would be able to be mounted on. But I just went ahead and removed a little bit more so the turret slides on and rotates in a smoother manner. So in order to address this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to build up this layer here with putty. So I'm going to use my red putty. It's the same stuff that I've been using for the other areas of the bodywork. I'm just going to build it up in this area over here. The amount of red putty that's needed is not going to be too substantial, which is good because you really don't want to use red putty in that manner because it is too lean base. It can actually have an adverse effect and actually start melting the polystyrene surface. And if that's the case, it will be better to use some kind of a two-part epoxy like Milliput or A's for the buildup. But for this over here, I believe I could pull it off with the red putty. Also, during the paint stripping process, there was a bit of cracking going on in this area over here where large chunks of plastic were just destroyed. So I'm just going to fill those in really quick with the red putty. Build that up and plug up these holes as well. Okay, just a quick little smear should do it. Alright, so now I'm going to focus on building this area up here with the red putty. At first, it's not going to look very pretty because obviously you want to have a nice buildup of the material so that allows you to then sand it down to the appropriate dimensions when that time does come. Okay, so the putty has been added. It is a bit more substantial than I initially thought, but this should be okay. So I'm just going to let this thing set and let the putty harden fully. The thicker the putty is on a location, the more dry time it will require. So time to set this thing aside and come back to it probably a day or so from now. Okay, with the red putty now polished down, the turret sides look to be ready for the detail fittings to be remounted. The big dented in area on the side of the turret appears to have also been taken care of, and now that everything's polished down, it should be a nice seamless appearance. Looking over the repair area over here, you can see that that dent has been blended over, and also that bottom leading edge is now completely flat, as it was originally before the mishap happened. The only thing that I need to still add to this section here to finish it off is a small little weld bead line, basically like the one we have here on the front. There's a small little line that runs in this area over here. I'm going to carefully mark it with a pencil and then add it with a Dremel. With the turret fully repaired and detailed out, the next thing to turn my attention to is the main gun components. Like I touched upon before, the mantlet and rotor are not going to be salvaged and are replaced with a cast resin copy. And that leads us now to the barrel. The barrel, too, during the paint stripping process did not hold up at all and basically just disintegrated on me. So this piece here is also not going to be salvaged. But, however, there is a perfect drop-in installation replacement out there that I'm going to be using on this build, and that can be found right over here on the table. This piece here is a HD 3D printed component from shapeways.com. The link for this component is listed below in the video description. The piece here is a direct drop-in replacement for the Tamiya 76mm, so it was ideal for this type of a project. The component is very nicely detailed, and it has all the appropriate geometry to the muzzle brake as well as to the little bore evacuator. And since it's a drop-in Tamiya replacement, there's going to be absolutely no problems whatsoever of getting this component mounted to the mantlet and then finally to the tank itself. Before I go ahead and do that, however, I am going to first super glue the barrel in place, to which then I can go ahead and thoroughly prime everything with the flat black spray paint. One thing that I noticed is with the HD material, if you are using any sort of like a Model Master type enamel, the material will have this weird effect. Not at first. You'll build the model, paint it, and it'll look fine. And then after a few months or a year or so, you'll look at it, and it'll have like this like crystal stuff growing on the surface, and it looks really, really bad. So I found that when it comes to painting the HD stuff, you want to use an acrylic type paint, but you still need to have some kind of a primer on top of it. For my builds, I like to use flat black spray paint as the primer, and so far from what I've seen for the last few years, the models that have HD printed parts that have been primed with flat black spray paint and then airbrushed over with acrylics and latexes hold up and fare out very, very well, and I haven't had any problems with the material crystallizing. But this is something I did want to touch upon with the HD material. So the piece is going to be primed, of course, and the reason for priming the component is just so that I could go ahead and get paint into this area over here, so that when it comes time for final installation, there are going to be no missed spots where paint was not able to get into certain locations. This is a common thing to watch out for, by the way, on basically all tank models. When you have a rotor mantlet type setup like this here, you are going to have some sections where the paint's just not going to get to. So it would behoove you to go ahead and pre-paint these areas prior to final assembly. So here's the barrel now mounted to the mantlet. Big shocker, no surprises with the installation. Also, one other benefit that this barrel does have is that it is a single printing, so because of that, there are no seams to contend with. The stock Tamiya barrel is a two-part barrel assembly, which is, quite typical on most plastic tank kits out there. So if you are building one, you are going to have to deal with that little seam that runs across the top and bottom portion of the barrel. With the 3D printed one, obviously that's not the case. Now, the seam work is nothing that's really a problem. In fact, if my barrel here did not disintegrate, chances are really good I would have just been able to polish it up and take care of the seam work if any were to remain. But if you are in a position where your stock barrel is broken or lost for whatever reason, there are a lot of these models out there on the secondhand market that are, in dire need of repair like this one was. The drop-in 3D printed barrel over here is a fantastic solution for your problem. And here's the turret now fully repaired, completed, and at this point it's actually ready for painting. You can see that all of the bodywork has been completed, and all of the surface details have been remounted. Of course, the surface details here are the cast resin copies that I touched upon before. Once this model is fully painted and weathered, it's just going to blend in like any other Tamiya M41. Aside from the resin details, I also went ahead and added some extra details to the model. First would be the little grab handles found on the lower hatch and the cupola. These here are integrally molded with the stock model, but they're just a little blade that's rendered on these sections, which is quite typically found on Tamiya kits. And in the typical manner, the blades were cut away, sanded flush, and then new holes were drilled into these surfaces, where a new wire handle was fabricated out of some thin floor wire. This will greatly help the look of the model once it's fully completed. The other detail I added was a HD 3D printed periscope brush guard, which would be found on this section over here. This is a set that I picked up from shapeways.com a number of months ago that I've used on several other builds that have, been posted on this channel. The link to this section and the vendor is found in the video description below. These pieces are highly recommended, specifically if you build a lot of US AFV, World War II and 1950s era tanks included, and they are a great drop-in installation that really do help the look of the model once everything is fully mounted. From the periscope takes us to the commander's cupola hatch. As we saw before at the start of the project, the hatch was non-functional. When I built the model originally, I think I used too much paint on the inside portion or some glue seeped in, and regardless, the hatch was just permanently shut in the closed position. Well, fortunately, I was able to fix that, and as you can see, the hatch is now fully functional again. All of the thick, clunky paint and glue was cleaned away, leaving for the hatch to now open fully. The hinges, one of them was the stock original one that was able to be salvaged. The other one here is a cast resin copy that I touched upon before. This particular model, the hatch being functional is actually really important because on the inside we have here our three-way position switch, which will allow the model to be turned on either in the forward or the reverse direction. From there also takes us to the folding pencil mount. The pencil mount here is the cast resin copy of the stock one, and I went ahead and amputated out the section for the M23 cradle, which was integrally molded to this section here. This is going to be needed because towards the end of the build I am going to mount on a proper M2HB, which will be a huge improvement compared to the stock original unit that was supplied with the kit. But again, more info on that's going to be seen towards the latter half of the video. While working on the upper hull, one feature found on the Tamiya kit that always irked me was with the sponsons. Just like with many other Tamiya kits from the past as well as with the present, the sponsons are molded hollow and there's nothing going on in there. To get an idea what I'm talking about, here you can see my other M41 that I'm working on, to get an idea what the pieces look like in their El Natural state. The next thing that I added to this model here is this little strip of Plastruct. This was added as a spacer in order to mount the top onto the lower in a tighter manner. Now, I'm not sure if this is because when I was installing the piece, I installed it improperly, but with the way it was before, it held it on, but it was a bit on the looser side, and I noticed that when I would put the battery on the inside, with the extra equipment inside the front section over here, it was really causing the front not to line up flush against the section here as it should. So what I went ahead and did was I added this little piece of plastic to this area. So now when the piece gets mounted in, it locks on in a much more efficient manner. And once it snaps over that little piece of plastic, you can see that the upper and lower hulls are held on in a much stronger manner. It's going to be interesting when I build the other M41 to see if this is going to be necessary, as that one, the bulkhead was installed in a proper manner. And at this point here, the model has been fully repaired and is actually ready for painting. Since the last scene, the last of the work was done to the front area over here, where we can see that the headlights have been fully repaired. The original headlights, some of them popped off during the reconstruction, and despite my best efforts of trying to reattach them, they eventually got lost, and so new ones were casted out of resin. In addition to the lights, you'll notice that the brush guards have also been refabricated. As I touched upon before, they did not hold up at all during the paint stripping process, and frankly, they didn't hold up from the original construction of the build, like so many other components on this model. So, in its place, I fabricated two brand new brush guards. These are fabricated out of thin pieces of soda can, just aluminum, that were cut into very thin strips and then just bent to the appropriate shapes and then mounted to the model. With the guards now added, the model at this point, like I said before, is ready to slide off into paint. And here's the model entering into its painting stage. Of course, step one, which is the ground level, is that the model needs to be coated with some sort of a surface primer. And of course, if anyone watches my videos, you'll know that for my primer needs, I use none other than El Cheapo Flat Black Spray Paint. And what I mean by El Cheapo is literally that. Like, you know, the stuff that runs about 98 cents or so a can. Like this one that we have over here from Lowe's. But basically every home improvement store has some sort of a really cheap, economic spray can for this type of a color paint. If you go with some of the more expensive paints like Krylon or Rust-Oleum, not only do they cost way more than the cheap stuff does, but in some occasions they actually have a habit of harming the finish, depending on the brand. So oddly enough, with this one here, stick with the cheaper stuff, and in my experience, it always seems to work out best. From here, I could then progress to the base coat and then the weathering. And of course, the primer is important for this because the paint will stick better to the surface that has the coat of primer on it, as opposed to surfaces that just have bare exposed plastic. For the model's overall paint finish, I'm going to be going with a post-Korean War era of U.S. military vehicle. And during this era, the U.S. military utilized a darker shade of olive drab compared to what was seen previously, like during World War II. However, this color was not nearly as dark to what was going to come in the 1960s and the 70s. But for the coat itself, I'm going to be utilizing my own mix of exterior latex paint. This is the same paint that I've touched upon in a few other videos. And this is nothing more than flat exterior latex that I'm going to dilute with tap water in order for it to be thin enough so that I can apply it with the airbrush. The application and the techniques are identical to what was seen on some of the other videos that have been posted on the OTR lineup. And if anyone's interested exactly how I go about all this, I recommend checking those videos out. And here's the model at the end of the restoration. Let's go ahead and take a quick walk around this model. starting with the suspension and the running gear, there's nothing really much to talk about over here because all the components you see are stock with the model. This was one aspect of the model that wasn't broken or anything, so basically it just needed to be cleaned off and repainted. So all the components, again, are stock, with of course the exception of the modifications made to the sprocket in order to have it be a motorized model. But the one thing that I do want to touch upon is how the running gear is painted. And it's interesting to point out on the M41 because by and large it follows the same format as the other contemporary American tanks of the period, like the M47, the M46, and also the M48. However, it does differ in one section, and that is with the front idler wheel. The roll wheels themselves, along with the return rollers, have rubber rims on them, as they would on those other vehicles I mentioned. However, with the front idler, these are steel rimmed and do not have any sort of rubber tire on them whatsoever. So when you're building your M41, be it a old school Tamiya one, or even one of the Skybow or a V-Club kits, be sure to paint the rim in a steel color that we have here. On a similar note, this takes us to the tracks, and as I've mentioned on many American tank videos, the M41's tracks are no different, again, to the other contemporaries that I mentioned, as well as more or less like the M113, where we have a sealed track link, but it has a rubber track pad that's bolted on the front, and there's also another rubber pad found on the inside portion where we have the row wheels making contact with the link. On the Tamiya model, the exterior portion of the track is very decently rendered for what it is. It's actually one of the better tracks that were made of the period, and honestly hold up even today by and large. However, like with other contemporaries of the era, the Tamiya track is absent the interior track detailing. And if you're working on one of these Tamiya kits, one sheer bet way to really improve the model without having to do any other type of major work is to simply paint them in the configuration that we have here. So the way these are painted is that the tracks are painted, of course, with a base color of Tamiya flat black. And then I go ahead and add the rusting colors that we have here. Generally on my videos, I mentioned that the tracks don't really rust all that frequently on these real tanks. However, on post-World War II tanks, such as the Pattons, the M113s, and so on and so forth, those tracks do tend to develop rust on them. And it's also a good thing that they do because the rust tends to grow on areas, of course, that are steel. But this is great as a modeling standpoint because you can really make the two different materials stand out with not a whole lot of effort. What I mean by this is, well, again, the track link itself is painted with rust colors, while then the rubber sections are painted after the rust is done with the Tamiya rubber black, giving you the look that we have here. And if anyone has ever seen these real tanks in person, they tend to have a look very similar to what you see here. If you're building one of these models and you don't want to render the tracks in a rusty manner, that's totally fine. It's just that when you do this, you want to use a different shade of a dark gray or a black for the metal sections, as opposed to the Tamiya rubber black that's used for, well, the rubber parts. I have done this in the past on a few other builds, and it is something that can still be done, and it'll still give for some really good results. For the outer sections of the track, of course, the triangle portion is painted. However, for the inside one, it's a little bit trickier because there's no clear-cut molded track link detailing on the inside, but this actually lends itself for some ease of painting because all you gotta do is with a paintbrush, just paint one section on either side of the tooth that we have here with the black paint, and you leave the little section that has the tooth cut out left in the metal coloring. This is all that you need to do to have some excellent results like you see here. And it's a great way to add extra detailing to something that really is quite plain and doesn't have normally any detail on its surface. From there, it takes us to the rear section here, and as I touched upon before during the video, this was one area of the model that did receive some heavy damage and also required quite a bit of reconstruction. Well, now that the reconstruction is completed and fully painted, it looks completely seamless and it blends in with the remainder of the model. Also, all of those cast resin copies of all the Tamiya parts that I mentioned before just flesh everything out, and the model looks indistinguishable compared to just a standard freshly built Tamiya counterpart. Of course, the travel lock, which is one of the more iconic features found on the M41 family, is still fully functional. If anything, it's better built now than it was originally, because now at least it has a metal pin that is the hinge point, as opposed to that arguably flimsy plastic peg system that was found on the original Tamiya model. Of course, on this one here, I rendered it in the closed position for the reasons that I touched upon earlier in the video. Hopping to the front of the model, again, you can see some of the replacements that were added, and they are a carbon copy of the Tamiya, so it blends in with the remainder of the detailing. However, one bit of detailing, of course, that was scratch built were the brush guards. These ones were scratch built out of thin sections of aluminum, as I touched upon before, but now that everything is fully completed, you can see how they enhanced the front of the model. Unlike the original kit supply ones, which were overscaled in order for them to be moldable with the polystyrene machines of the time, the metal ones here are much more to scale, and they really do assist the model and really polish it up past the kit original configuration. Of course, it's also noteworthy to point out that the only reason why I had to do all of this was because the original guards did not survive the rebuild process, and if they did, chances are really good I would have kept the original guards. But since I had the opportunity to replace them outright for this build, I went ahead and went the little extra mile. And again, because this model was in such bad condition, and it's basically my atonement for building it poorly the first time around. So this kit honestly earned the enhanced brush cards that we see here. The next thing I want to mention is the tool rack. Of course, this is one of the more unique features found on post-World War II American tanks, where we have all of the tools on this little convenient rack that is present somewhere on the vehicle. On the M41, it's right here on the fender. This is, of course, the kit supplied unit, as I touched upon before, and the only thing that the builder really needs to do to bring it up to its full potential is to simply paint the tools. Now, this is something that's a little bit harder in practice than it sounds, because of the way everything is molded flat. You do have to very carefully go in there with a very fine precision paintbrush with just the right amount of paint and at the right consistency, no less, in order to properly paint and weather all of the metal sections on the tools, which will of course be the pickaxe, shovel head, the shovel handle, as well as the axe itself, as well as the handles for the appropriate areas. In addition to that, one other way to really enhance the thing without really having to do that much extra work is to paint the little nylon strap. The straps found on these post-World War II American vehicles are made out of this olive green nylon type material, and if anyone's ever seen real military vehicles, have been in the service or have been to any surplus store, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about with these things. And the way they are present is basically the way that you see them on this model. This here is painted with just Tamiya olive green, and it really does stick out from the remainder of the vehicle with this dark olive drab coloring. The nice little swipe here of olive green gives a little bit extra color, and again, it's a way to enhance the model as opposed to leaving it overpainted. One thing that you don't want to do is paint this with leather type coloring, as this is used on World War II tanks. However, post World War II, the leather was out and the nylon was in. On the opposite side, we have a little length here of spare track. And again, just like with the main tracks on the model, just simply painting the components accordingly is all the builder needs to do to really make them shine. The rubber sections are painted as rubber. The metal sections are painted as rusty metal. And also, of course, these straps are painted with the same color of the tank. That's all you need to do in order to get this piece correctly painted. And again, it just makes for a better build once done. On the rear area, you get to see the exhaust manifolds, and this was something that I always loved about this era of American tanks, and this is again true for the M47, where we have these gigantic mufflers that are present on the two tin sections. The pieces were simply painted in the rusty format that we have here. The heat shields themselves have airbrush rust coloring on them. However, the actual muffler exhausts themselves have the sophisticated finishes rust agent applied to them, which gives them a little bit of a darker, richer color, which again would make sense because these here would weather and rust way faster compared to the heat shields that sit over them. And because of that, you really have a nice 1-2 punch with the color found on the areas over here. Of course, airbrush black was added for the soot, for the exhaust smoke, in order just to seal everything off. On the engine deck itself, we have the various fluid filler caps. And of course, I use my typical spillage type effect for the weathering for the results that you see here. And if anyone has ever tried to top off a fuel tank or any sort of a fluid filler spout on some heavy machinery with a funnel and with a gas can, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about when you see the drips like you see here. From the hull brings us to the turret, and this was one aspect of the rebuild that was one that required probably the most amount of work in order to fully restore it from the original condition. As I mentioned before, this model's turret here had quite a few mistakes when I first built the model, and one of the aspects that I botched were with the side grab handles. The grab handles that you see here are, of course, the Tamiya resin copy ones that I went ahead and made, and you can see that once they are added to the side, they really flesh out appropriately and give the model that proper M41 look. Of course, in order to do that, several portions of bodywork were required, and you can see here that the bodywork was a complete success, and the model is completely smooth with its surface. On that note, just like which is commonly seen on many of the other OTR builds, this one here does, or I should say did have that stupid plague of those dumb tick marks that are present on a lot of my older builds. Well, as I showcased earlier how that was polished away, you can see the final end result, and the piece looks absolutely flawless. Also, that was cleaned up were the weld beads, and you can see how the weld beads look in this configuration now, and again, it makes for a nicer build compared to my first attempt. Of course, the mantlet is a direct replacement from the original one, which was not able to be salvaged, as I mentioned before, along with the main barrel. Because the piece is just a resin copy, it just dropped in without any problems, and the barrel is that HD 3D printed resin component from shapeways.com. This is a very nicely detailed piece, and is definitely something that you can add in order to enhance this stock barrel on your Tamiya M41. More importantly than just enhancing the stock barrel, if you are working on a rebuild like this one over here, or if you find one of these old kits clunking around in a garage sale because, you know, they're so plentiful and a lot of people have built them, you know, for so long, finding one of these older kits in a trash condition is something that can easily be done for a relatively low amount of money. And if you do want to embark on that journey, the replacement of the stock barrel with this one over here is a great way to enhance the model. It just drops in easily, it looks fantastic, and it just, you cannot go wrong with the addition of this piece, specifically on your restoration. The only thing on the main barrel right now is that it is a bit loose, as we can see, but this is something I can easily fix with a little bit of white glue on the interior trunnion mounts, which I have the bottle glue right there in the corner. It's probably something I'm going to do after the filming of this video before I put this one away. But as you can see, though, the barrel being made out of resin is actually nice because it's lightweight as opposed to something like a aluminum barrel, which can add a little bit of extra weight on the end. But this one here, it definitely, you get the detailing, actually probably arguably better detailing compared to some CNC aluminum barrels, but with the light weight found with the 3D printed material. Carrying on, takes us to the brush guard that we have here. As I mentioned, this is a 3D printed brush guard from Shapeways. I have a set of them, and they have been mentioned on a number of these 1/35 scale tank videos. The Walker Bulldog is actually one of the more unique ones because it's one of the last tanks to utilize this pattern of brush guard. The other vehicle from this era that utilized a guard similar to this, or actually this exact same guard, was I believe the M114 reconnaissance vehicle. Other than that, after those two vehicles, this design here was basically retired. But that's really just a side note. As for the model here, the 3D printed resin piece, again, is a nice recommendation. And it's a really good set to keep in your stash in case you build any sort of World War II or, you know, post-World War II American vehicles, and you want to enhance them with some nice detailing that really doesn't require all that much extra effort to install. Moving towards the rear of the turret takes us to the antenna bases, and this was, as I may have mentioned before, something that I changed compared to the stock original. We have here two patterns of antenna bases. We have an MP65 and we have an MP48. The MP48, of course, is one of the older units and was something that was a carryover from the World War II time period. However, this pattern of antenna base would not be uncommon for a M41 from the 1950s time frame. The MP48 is the CNC brass unit from Panzer Art. I have mentioned this in a number of my videos, and it is an excellent piece, and it's something that you really cannot go wrong on. I'm not really sure on the availability of these components anymore. For a while, they were kind of prolific on eBay, but it's been a few years since I've purchased them, so I'm not sure what the status is of this component. However, I will say if you have the opportunity to find them, definitely buy a few sets because they come in really handy, specifically if you build American tanks. In order to paint it, just like with the MP65 that I'm going to touch upon in a second, same format found on all the other ECA builds. And again, this is one thing I cannot stress enough because most people out there tend to mess this up. The MP48 is an olive drab component. However, the ribs are a porcelain color, and in order to properly render it, the porcelain needs to be painted some kind of an amber color. In my opinion, the best color for this is Tamiya Hull Red with a little extra swipe of gloss coat on it just to give it that nice sheen. The antenna base wire, or I should say the antenna wire itself, is the kit original one that comes with the Panzer Art set. It's a little piece of metal wire. It's nicely detailed. It inserts into the pre-drilled hole found on the MP48. In order to complete the look, you just have to paint it in this configuration. The wire itself is black. However, on the real unit, there are two knurled end tips found on either end. We have a blue one down here and a red one here on top. Now, in 1/35 scale, obviously you're not going to be able to fabricate the little knurled end bit, and if you can, my hat's off to you. Congratulations, you're really good at this. However, one way to achieve the same look without having to go when actually produce the piece is with a little swipe of paint on the top and the bottom. On the bottom here, a swipe of blue, and on the top, a little swipe of red paint is all you need, and you have the look of the knurled end tips without really having to fabricate anything. Can't stress that enough. On the MP65, this here is a copy of the Tamiya plastic one that comes with the kit. The kit gives you two of these units to mount in these locations, but for this one here, I wanted to make it look a little bit different compared to the other M41 that's in my collection, where that one has the two MP65s, spoiler alert, while this one here, obviously I went with one of which being the MP48. The MP65 is similarly painted with the porcelain, but only on the MP65. The porcelain's on the bottom portion here. It kind of looks like the thing that you see for spreading honey, or you see it always on the Cheerios boxes. And the top portion is actually flexible because it's made out of rubber. So when you paint an MP65, it's in this format. The bottom portion with the ribs is porcelain, Tamiya Hull Red, a little swipe of gloss, and then the rubber portion is just flat black or Tamiya Rubber Black. Either would be suffice. Also on the MP65, you'll notice I did not connect the antenna to it, and this is something that I have mentioned on many other models that utilize the MP65. Problem with trying to add the wire to the 65 is you see that there's two widths here of material, and trying to add the antenna wire to that is a fool's errand. These pieces are so tiny that you are not going to be able to get the wire fitted in place. So it's best to just leave the piece wireless. The antennas, of course, are something that's removable, and it's not uncommon to see these units in this configuration without the wire present. So if you can, you could just leave it in the configuration that you have here, and there will be no problems in terms of accuracy. On the tail portion of the model, it takes to the two jerry cans. These are the original kit supply jerry cans, but have been cleaned up a little bit. And I also went ahead and improved them by adding some spare handles to both of these sections here. The handles were just clunking around my spare bin and were a simple addition to make. The spout itself is a nail or a wire brad, I believe, and again, this is what the piece looks like fully painted. In order to really enhance the pieces further, you'll notice I painted them with the top portions being red. On post-World War II American jerry cans, and I'm pretty sure this is the case for World War II also, but definitely post-World War II, because I have one, the cans were in this configuration that held gasoline. The Walker Bulldog was a gasoline-powered vehicle, so this is the configuration that you would find with these jerry cans. Of course, to paint the jerry cans, I used Tamiya Olive Drab for the main body, and Tamiya Flat Red for the top section. Weathering and washes were added to give it the look that we see here. For this one, you'll notice that the straps are not painted with the olive green, but I went ahead and went with a khaki type coloring. Again, this is something that would be seen specifically on transitional vehicles like this one here. Now, this may seem like a contradiction from what I said before with the green nylon strap found on the tool rack. However, keep in mind again, there was still a large number of these khaki webbing type straps that were used for jerry cans that were still floating around U.S. inventory during this time. However, you will not see these components in leather, and leather was primarily used on tool posts and were not really used on jerry cans. So painting these with leather is definitely going to be something that would hurt the look of the build. Moving away to the cupola, as I mentioned earlier, this did require quite a bit of reconstruction because the original components were heavily just damaged or were just not salvageable. So the cupola is fully functional, and on this model it has to be because of the motorization feature that I've mentioned before. And as you can see, the hatch still operates absolutely perfectly, even with the coats of paint and the varnish that have been added on top. Of course, the periscopes are painted, and as I frequently mention in these videos, the way I personally like to paint periscopes is in this type of format. There are a lot of people out there who like to paint periscopes with a blue color. In my opinion, from the vehicles that I've crawled around on and saw in person, they tend to be in this type of format where, specifically if the vehicle is off and there's no one on the inside, it's just black. And so gloss black is my way to go. Of course, after the black is added, a nice little brush of Tamiya gloss is added just to give that nice glass look like you see here. Same thing is also done, by the way, on the two front periscopes on the tank itself. From there brings us to the MG mount. The pintle mount, like I stated before, is the stock one. It was simply just repurposed. However, the M2 is definitely not the one that came with the original model. This is the HD 3D printed set from shapeways.com. The link, like I mentioned before, is listed in the video description. And again, I can't recommend these sets enough. They are probably one of the best M23 mounted M2 HBs on the market. You can't go wrong with them. They are just awesome. And in order to just seal the deal, you can see how the unit was fully painted. If anyone's a fan of my content, either 1.6 or 1.16 or 1.35, the weathering on this should look pretty much familiar because this is basically the style that I like to render my model MGs in. The unit, of course, is dry brush, giving you the distressed look that we have here. And the grips, I went with the red Bakelite look because, again, this is something that would be common for an M2 HB. The belt was also painted, and in order to paint the belt, the links themselves are a black coloring, the shells are brass, and the projectiles are painted in copper. By simply painting all the ammo belts with these three colors, it's a simple way to enhance the model further compared to just painting everything brass, which tends to be a standard, I don't want to say a rookie move, because I've seen a lot of nice builds and quote-unquote professional builders out there do that too, so it's kind of staggering how they just miss this little bit of extra detailing here. That's the only thing that you need to really enhance the model further. Same thing, by the way, is also true on that note for the rear taillights. The rear taillights, people always seem to screw this up. The one on this side is in red, while the one on this side is a blackout light. Take note, people always make a mistake with that. They always paint them red, or I've even seen people paint the whole face red like I did when I was a kid. So, yeah, that is something you definitely want to take notes of when you're working on any sort of American vehicle from World War II all the way up to even today. And that's it for the detailing. This brings us to the model's paint, the markings, and the weathering. For the model's paintwork, I went with the 1950s dark shade of olive drab that I've utilized on a few other builds that have been seen on this channel already, one of which was the Monogram M41A2 that comes to mind. The model was painted with the base coat, and I added several washes and filters to it via the airbrush to get the look that you see here. Then for the weathering, this is accomplished with both dry brushing as well as the airbrush, giving the distressed look that is present on this model on all the surfaces. And then that brings us to the markings. For the model's markings, what you see here is a mix of Tamiya markings and also markings from Archer dry transfers. The Tamiya markings are the spare ones on the decal sheet that were not utilized after I built my other Tamiya M41. But some of the markings that I needed to acquire were the remainder of the US AFV stuff. So things like the stars and also the TO&E marks found on the front and rear portions here. I believe these ones here are Tamiya. I'm not really sure. It's been a while, honestly, since I finished this one. But the 106 is from the Tamiya one, but the other markings are from the Archer set. Now, in the past, I've utilized Archer dry transfers before, and they were always awesome. Unfortunately, Archer does not make dry transfers anymore for one reason or another. And they now switched over to water slide decals, which in itself there's nothing wrong with that. However, I will say I was a bit surprised when I got the markings and I applied them, because the Archer decals, although the quality on them is excellent, they are excellent quality markings. One thing that the builder does need to do is they need to meticulously cut out the marking with an X-Acto knife. Now, this may not be a surprise specifically to dudes that do model airplanes, because I've seen them always do that even when the markings are already pre-cut. But for me, this is something that honestly caught me by surprise, and it was not something that I'm used to. So I actually have to go and meticulously then cut out each little piece on this star. And with the way the decal sheet is, the whole decal sheet is everything in one piece. So you physically have to cut everything out, and you have to do it precise, and you have to go in there and make sure there's not a whole lot of edging. Honestly, it's a bit of a pain. I really wish Archer would go ahead and have decals that are like the other ones supplied with these kits, and also with many of the other aftermarket decal makers out there, where the marking, basically the leading edge, is the end of the marking. So that's something I really wish that they would do. But again, the quality of the markings are still excellent. It's one of those things, the markings are really, really good. If you're in a bind and you want markings, the Archer sets are excellent. It's just you are going to have to put in a little bit of extra elbow grease in order to separate them from the page. The stars aren't too bad. They're relatively easily done. It's, you know, I do stencils on my 1/6 scale model, so I'm used to cutting out stars. However, the TO and E marks, that's where things get a little tricky, because each number needs to be individually cut and then individually kerned and leaded in place, and that is something that it requires patience, to put it mildly. And but again, it's doable, and once done, the decals are excellent quality. The decals went on. I didn't have any problems with tearing or anything along those lines, and then they just went and adhered on via the VMS matte varnish absolutely flawlessly. The decals on this thing are great. There's no complaints with them. The Tamiya decals, of course, are modern Tamiya decals, and basically Tamiya decals from any era are generally awesome. So the Tamiya markings adhered on, no problems, as did the Archer ones, leaving for the final result that we have here. And again, I actually have no complaints on the end result. Of course, we're not done yet, because one of the main hat tricks that this build does have was that I converted it from static to motorization. Of course, I went over that in depth earlier on in the video, but might as well go ahead and test run this thing now that it's fully completed. Of course, this is simple motorization, but I went ahead and gave it a three-way switch so it could go both forward and reverse. And this was something that I always wanted to do as a kid, and was something that I always wished that my Bulldog had the capability for when I first built it back in the 90s. And fast forward to the 2020s, it's great that I can actually finally do this. So here we go. Of course, it's not going to break any land speed records here, but, you know, one, it is a tank, and this is actually kind of scale speed specifically in first gear. And the model runs really good. Let's go in reverse. And just like the original Tamiya counterpart with the stock electronic system, this one, the reverse, is equally as efficient as the forward. Now, of course, the gearbox on here is a nice piece if you want to motorize convert a model like this here. Of course, you cannot RC convert something because of the single motor system. But if you're just looking for a quick, simple motorization project, this gearbox here is recommended. The gearbox, admittedly, is a bit on the underpowered end. However, for a vehicle this size, namely a 1/35 scale, specifically M41 Walker Bulldog, the gearbox actually came out to work absolutely perfectly for it. If, as we can see on my other models, I tend to use the dual motor gearbox because it does give you a little bit more extra power. Having two motors as opposed to one gives you a little bit more speed, and that's also a fantastic, excellent gearbox. However, if you're working on a project where that gearbox is just not an option because you just can't fit it inside this compartment, the single motor gearbox here is a nice alternative. Again, with the caveat that you are only going with simple motorization. And there's something about getting one of these old school Tamiya kits here that were originally supposed to be motorized, but were robbed that capability for one reason or another, back to its original configuration being one that is functional. It just feels so accomplishing, it really does. One other thing I want to mention is that because the gearbox here uses broad plastic gears, it is going to have a much longer run time as opposed to the thin sheet metal gears that were used on the kit's original configuration. Sheet metal gears are really not that great because they actually strip out in less time than the zinc alloy glass jaw gearbox that are found on the 1/16 scale Tamias. And I'm talking from personal experience here. So with this gearbox here, this model is actually going to run pretty well. Albeit slow, but well and reliable. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. I'm pretty sure a lot of old school 70s builders out there are definitely appreciating what I'm referring to. Well, in the end, the final results really speak for themselves. I am just thrilled on how this one turned out. This was another one of those builds where when I finished it, I really realized that I did a really bad number on it, and it was one of those things that was guilt-tripping me for all of these years for me to finally give it the proper treatment that it deserves. And well, now that the model's in this condition here and restored to my original intent of making it motorized, I really cannot be any happier on the final end result. It took me a couple decades to get to it, but I think it was definitely well worth it. Of course, if you made it to this video, I want to give you my heartfelt thanks. I understand how short people's attention spans are, specifically on YouTube and in today's day and age. And for you to make it to this portion of the video, clearly you must have really been engaged in the content. So I definitely want to give you my thanks for that. Also, perhaps if you're watching this video, this may motivate you to perhaps revisit one or two of your older builds that may have fell in a state of disarray, or possibly were builds that you didn't really have the skill set or did a good job on the first time around, and perhaps, just perhaps, instead of having them languish away in a bin somewhere or possibly worse, thrown into the trash, maybe a little revision with some elbow grease would be just the thing needed in order to turn it around and make it a showpiece in your collection. Of course, this model here is now going to be put in a nice dust-proof little box, which then it will be put on display in the collection, where it's definitely going to be with some good company. Some of which were some shelf mates of this particular model, because again, it was sitting in the same shelf as many of the other OTR alumni that have been showcased on this channel in the past. And with that, that wraps up this episode of Old Tank Repair. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe to this channel, where it's a great way to keep up to date on new posted content, being other Old Tank Repair videos like this one over here, to the other model showcase video and large-scale project update videos that frequently get posted to this channel. Another way to keep in loop of new posted content is by liking us on Facebook. There, I have more photographs of this particular model, as well as the other smaller and larger scale builds that have been seen on this channel in the past. Furthermore, don't forget to swing by eastcoastarmory.com for more 1/6 and 1/16 scale builds and detailed components. Thanks again, and I'll be seeing you all again on the next one. Till then.